Okay, welcome back everybody. So the next session, we're really delighted to have Neal Hughes with us. And Neal is a senior economist with ABARES, and he's going to be presenting some research to us that will be really valuable to the advisor community about measuring the effects of drought on farm businesses. So welcome, Neal. Really delighted to have you here and joining the chat and discussion this morning.
No problems. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So I'm just going to quickly describe some work that we've been doing at ABARES that I think is relevant to the conversation we're having today. Essentially, some modelling that ABARES has been doing, which I think could be useful for farmers and farm advisors, helping to provide a bit more of an objective picture on the sensitivity of particular farm businesses to drought effects and how climate is changing and affecting the droughts that farmers face and the impact of that on their profits. So let me move ahead. Okay. So this is all based on ABARES farm surveys. ABARES has been running surveys of farm businesses for more than 50 years in various formats. Our Broadacre Farm Survey covers about 1,600 farms each year, all around Australia, and we collect very detailed information through in-person interviews, including not just the physical production on those farms, but their detailed financial data. At ABARES, we've been working the last few years on basically turning that data into a model, linking that data with various other pieces of information, including weather data and commodity price information, to build a statistical model to be able to predict the outcomes for individual farm businesses. So to be able to look at a map and put your finger on a map and say, if there's a farm there, and it has this much land and this many cows and this many sheep, and you know, given the weather conditions and the commodity prices it faces, then simulate its production, its costs, its revenues, and its financial performance. Okay, my slides seem to have been missing something there. So outlining how we do this, basically take a model like I've just been describing, you input into that weather data, historical weather data and forecast weather data, and you can basically translate the weather data into sequences of farm outcomes. So instead of looking at volatility and rainfall and temperature, you combine all of that and understand what does it actually mean for the thing that farmers care most about, in this case, for example, farm profits. Once you've got that farm profit information, you can then use that to do a range of things. So for one, you can look at drought indicators. So defining whether a given farm or location is in drought or not, measuring the extent and severity of drought in terms of farm profit impacts rather than in terms of rainfall. And you can also look at the sensitivity of those farms. So what's the magnitude of variation in profits for that farm between a normal and a drought year? And how does that vary across different types of farms? And is that sensitivity to drought changing, increasing or decreasing over time? So here's some measurements on drought risk or sensitivity. So it's very farm specific, and it varies a lot depending on the type of farm and obviously the location. Okay, my slides are malfunctioning. That's unfortunate. I will just go from memory. So essentially two main drivers of variation in the sensitivity of farms to drought. First is obviously their location. You can kind of see that on the map if you're fortunate enough to be in one of those higher rainfall zones closer to the coast. you tend to see less volatility in your financial outcomes, less drought risk. It also depends a lot on the enterprise mix, so particularly the mix between cropping and livestock. If you're a farm that has basically wall-to-wall crops, you tend to have a lot more risk, a lot more volatility in your profits compared to a diversified farming business that has a broad mix, particularly a mix of sheep and cropping activities. Oh, okay, what just happened? All right, well, you can see the slides. Looks like somebody else is driving at this point. So the other thing you can do is you can generate drought indicators. So traditionally, the standard measure of whether a farm or location is in drought has been rainfall. So going back 50 or more years in Australia, we've used these rainfall decile measures to essentially define the existence of drought. But it's been clear for a long time that rainfall is a pretty poor measure of whether a farm business is in drought or not. And our research at ABARES kind of confirmed this recently, showing that there's pretty weak correlation between the usual rainfall metrics, so something like, say, rainfall over the previous 12 months, and actual farm outcomes, farm profits. And there are a range of factors between rainfall and farm outcomes, as you can see there, that mediate that relationship. So yeah, if we can jump forward to the next slide. So what we've been doing recently at ABARES is developing a new measure of drought that's based on farm outcomes, specifically farm profit outcomes, as opposed to rainfall. So on the left here, you have an example of a standard rainfall indicator. This is for the 2018-19 drought year. And that tells you whether or not rainfall over a 12-month period was low relative to what it normally is. And on the right, you have the farm outcome-based indicator, where that actually tells you whether farm profits were lower than normal due to the combined effects of weather conditions that farms experienced in that year. So we click forward, you can see some differences start to emerge. So in Western New South Wales, the standard rainfall indicator picked up areas that didn't really appear to be drought affected, whereas the outcome-based indicator did, because it took into account the fact that conditions were dry prior to the start of the year. We had record high temperatures compounding the low rainfall. We also had extremely high fodder prices due to the kind of widespread drought that contributed to bad profit outcomes for livestock farms in that area. We click forward, you see Western Australia kind of see the opposite results, which was that there were some areas there that had some particularly low rainfall in that year. But the grain growers in that area actually didn't experience a decline in profit. If anything, farmers in that area actually had an increase in profit because of the severe drought on the eastern side of Australia and the elevated grain prices and hay prices that they were exploiting to great benefit. Okay, next slide. So a lot of this stuff that ABARES has been doing has kind of been purely in terms of research. We've been publishing reports and papers, but we're trying to get more into an operational position where we can produce this kind of analysis for individual locations and individual farm businesses. One example of that is this drought early warning system project, which is currently running between ABARES and CSIRO. And essentially we are producing an operational system to generate a range of these outcome-based drought indicators. So that involves ABARES modelling of farm profits that I've just been describing, along with some other biophysical modelling of crop yields and pasture growth at CSIRO and in the Queensland government, to then generate a range of these outcome-based measures that translate the weather data and the forecasts into estimates of agricultural outcomes. So another key distinction with this project is that we're starting to incorporate the BOM's new seasonal weather forecasts. So these indicators are not just looking back at the last 12 months, they're taking into account the best available forecasts we have for the coming season. So I can only imagine that I've probably used up my 10 minutes. So I'll stop there. There's a lot of more information available and some links in the slides. Happy to share those around and take any questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Neil, and a huge amount of work going into that. Obviously, you know, getting a model that can support, you know, some sort of risk profile moving forward is really vital for the industry. We've got a lot of models that can sort of assess things retrospectively and do it really well and really quite accurately. But yes, moving forward, having something that can look a little bit, you know, forward facing will be of great value. How do people interact? How can people access that, or is it still in the research phase?
Yeah, so there's a number of reports that people can read. At the moment, we don't have an operational thing that farmers or farm advisors could click on and get a customised result. It's probably about 12 months away. So with that project, we're working towards having some of these numbers up in the Climate Services for Agriculture tool, which is currently being developed under the Future Drought Fund. So there's a prototype available on the internet at the moment. Our stuff is not in there, but hopefully in a year or so, you'll start to see more of this information. But if people are interested or have particular ideas about how this stuff can be used and useful to them, I'm more than happy to hear it.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Neil. Something to keep an eye on for the future, and because it's good to have an awareness of what work is being undertaken in this space. So if anyone's interested, maybe put your details in the chat and Neil can touch base with you at some stage. And I encourage people to still continue to put the comments in the chat. It's really helpful because they'll feed into all the thinking and all the responses that we can put together from here on in. So thank you very much, Neil. We will move on. I'd now just like to introduce Dr. Tim Clune, who's a lecturer in management and agribusiness at La Trobe University, and he's actually going to introduce and facilitate the next panel about what the research tells us.
That's great, Fiona. Thanks very much. And welcome to those out there in internet land to this last section of our webinar this morning. I think there's been some really exciting information that's come on board. In this next session, we're going to just have a brief discussion about drought and its impact on farm businesses and what the research is telling us. And to help us out with that, I'd like to introduce Richard Heath, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute, Dr. Lucie Newsome, who's a lecturer in management and economics at the University of New England, and Professor Ross Kingwell from the University of Western Australia. And they're going to give us, 5 to 10 minutes of their experience in the research space, working in policy and farm businesses, to identify some key messages about how drought is impacting farm businesses and what we can do to build on that information we've already had this morning. If you can keep your questions till towards the end, if you can put them in the Q&A, and we'll try and deal with them towards the end, and we'll just let the three speakers speak. But I think firstly, if I were to start with you, Richard, if you can come online, you're Executive Director of the Farm Institute, an independent think tank that looks at agricultural policy. You've got a long background, in working in research and advising research through organisations like the GRDC. What is your research telling us about where policy is going in terms of drought and farm businesses and communities?
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this really interesting discussion. So, look, I'm just going to give a quick summary of some work that we did on a specific research project that was managed by the National Farmers Federation, released at the beginning of last year, that looked at farm financial risk management with a big focus on drought, although it covered a broad range of financial risks. We were one of quite a few organisations that contributed to that piece of work, and we really focused on the government policy piece and whether government policy was appropriate for managing farm financial risk and where we think it should be heading. And really what I'm going to talk about is going to back up quite a few of the themes that we've heard this morning. So firstly, it's good just coming straight on the back of Neil's presentation and just recognising that the work they're doing now to get better indicators that move away from that straight measurement of rainfall and weather risk into incorporating a whole lot of other factors to understand whether farm businesses are impacted by drought or not is really important, because historically most government policy surrounding drought and farm financial risk has been based on that very crude indicator of straight, weather indexes and rainfall in particular. And the research really shows that it is virtually impossible to use that very sort of single crude indicator of rainfall as a single indicator that is appropriate for extending policy that assists farm businesses, whether they're in drought or not, because every farm business is different. Every farm business will have different risk appetites, different ways that they approach farm financial risk that deal differently with that single indicator. So it's really hasn't been that effective in terms of having policy that is aimed on just that single factor. So there has been a recognition that that policy needs to move away from assisting farm businesses directly, particularly on that one indicator, and more into what Chris was talking extensively about, which is the financial skills, the resilience skills to actually make better decisions around how farm businesses deal with financial risk, drought, and other financial risks, all those sorts of weather pressures that farm businesses will be exposed to. So I'll just cover off quickly on the 4 sort of policy areas that we made recommendations around. And that really was that government assistance to be effective should move away from assisting farm businesses directly towards more assisting individuals and families. And that's through doing things like delivering improvements in the assessment and extension of the farm household allowance, continuing, improving and expanding the rural financial counselling service, and provision of appropriately targeted skills development programs that really go to identifying, managing and assessing risk appropriately within farm businesses. The second area was around continuing, and there has been some policy change around this, so we acknowledge that, but sort of continuing that policy change and expanding on the incentivising preparation and innovation around farm business management. So financial incentives for grain storage, for fodder storage, for water infrastructure, for the sorts of things that are going to make more resilient farm businesses. The third area was around removing what are, quite a few perverse and distortionary drought policies at the moment. And, this is a contentious area, but frankly, things like hay subsidies and transport subsidies, which can have quite perverse outcomes in the way that they might keep some businesses functioning and delaying those hard decisions that are more fundamental around improving their resilience for future droughts. And then the final area, we've had quite a bit of interaction with Neal in this area and really support what they're doing and encourage better resourcing to enable ABARES to do more of that work around just the data-driven analysis of the effectiveness of farm policy. Agriculture's got really, really poor form on a government policy level of actually measuring the effectiveness of the initiatives that have been in place over time and understanding whether they work or not. So just getting better data systems around being able to do that. So those are the sort of 4 policy areas that we made recommendations around. I'll post the link to that report in the chat after I finish talking if anyone wants to have a look at it. The final area I'd like to quickly cover off on, just expanding the scope of the discussion a little bit and coming back to that idea that the most important thing that you can do to help farm businesses deal with drought is improve decision-making capacity, improve the way that farm businesses assess their risk options, is to really recognise that doesn't happen in isolation. Now, Chris did talk about how financial stress is proven to impair IQ, which is absolutely right. And I think we need to recognise that you need to look at the total environment that the farm business works in and how that all contributes to that mental health and well-being, rather than just confine the discussion to the farm business itself. Farm businesses exist in regional communities and regional economies. And when you get to extended droughts in particular, those regional economies really, really start to suffer as well as farm businesses, and that pervading sense of depression and stress and hard times flows right through the community. And so that impact on mental health and well-being and decision making, it can often come from just existing in that community as much as it does to that individual farm business itself. So from the policy perspective, recognising that and making sure that government policy is aimed at the entire community and not just farm business, I think would be a really welcome and constructive change that will have a direct impact on farm businesses. And I'll pull it up there, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Some interesting insights at that higher level decision making world from a policy maker's perspective. If I want to just drop down a level and bring you into the conversation, Lucie, you've spent time in policy at government level, and you now lecture in this space in management and economics, in this space that's part of that ecosystem in which agribusinesses operate, not just the farm, but those businesses that they rely on to provide the outputs that they provide. And we've heard a lot about that this morning in terms of some of those members of that ecosystem. What's the research telling you about how that ecosystem, for want of a better expression, is impacted by issues such as drought?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tim. So I'm Lucie Newsome, just to reiterate, and I'm at the University of New England and the UNE Centre for Agribusiness. So we've done 3 studies about this ecosystem of farm advisors that I'll just touch on the findings of. So one was a quantitative study measuring who's in the ecosystem and how drought and climate change, etc., are pulling more people in. And the other 2 studies were interviewing farm succession planners, and then a broader study on farm advisors and their businesses. So just to pick up on Richard's points about the interface between farm advisors and drought policy, we've seen this development of an ecosystem of support, and the impacts on are broader than those on producers. They impact communities and they impact the sector more broadly. So we looked at farm advisors in a broader sense than what we've probably been conceiving of in this session so far, beyond business consultancy and accounting and legal and banking. We also took into account science and technology services, as well as logistics, marketing, PR, HR, and as in order to accommodate the broader value chain of agriculture. So in terms of drought policy, the reason this ecosystem is increasingly important is because we've seen a retreat from government provision of services, both to rural communities and to producers, in terms of things like extension support, as well as historically, in the more longer term, the reduction in subsidies. So at the same time as we've seen this retreat of government support for services to producers and to rural communities, the business of production, of agricultural production, is increasingly complex. Consumers' expectations are changing, technology is changing. We've got the impacts of climate change. Producers are increasingly expected to self-regulate, to meet demanding standards of auditing, and also to defend their social license to operate. So the business of farming has become much more complex at the same time as supports have retreated that were traditionally provided at a government level, and Extension is a really good example of that, as are state marketing authorities. So what this trend really tells us is that the management of risks such as drought is moving from a state level, so a government level, to an individual producer level. And all of this manifests in the private market, so such as the advisors that we heard from earlier today, entering to fill the gap left by government, and also to help producers respond to this increasingly complex environment, and in order to maintain competitiveness and respond to risks such as drought. So this ecosystem plays a really important role in communicating scientific and financial developments and facilitating access to government incentives, so creating that bridge between producers and the state. And in addition to trying to producers relying on this ecosystem to an increasing extent, it's also become more financially viable, because the cost of inputs has risen to such a large extent that receiving advice or spending money on advice on how to optimize your inputs relative to the cost of inputs doesn't seem like that big a deal. So another study that we did looked at women's role in these advisory services in particular. And what we found was that the businesses of female advisors and professional service providers to agriculture was reliant upon having a really strong connection to community. And this was something that the business benefited from, but also communities benefited as well. So part of the entrepreneurship mission of these advisors was to fill gaps left that were existing in terms of service provision to communities. And they also were of these communities, so really wanting to, to benefit the people that they lived alongside. And as a result, they were able to develop really effective businesses. So what I'm seeing here is that this ecosystem is really important in terms of, tying both government policy to producer behaviour in terms of risk management. It's important for filling the gap in terms of services, but it's also quite exciting in terms of how it can disrupt traditional patterns of privilege in agriculture and allow new entrants into agriculture. So not just in terms of production, but in terms of this professional service provision. So when we quantified who's in the sector, we found that even though agricultural employment has declined over the past 4 decades, from about 7% in 91 to about 2% now, this wasn't capturing this whole range of people who are engaged in agriculture in this professional service space, such as the advisors that we heard from earlier today. So we counted about 14,000 people, if we conceived of the sector quite broadly, in terms of business advice, but also marketing, HR, PR, logistics, science and technology, and agronomy being included in that. And about half of this wasn't captured in the agricultural employment stats previously conceived. So we also found that the people in this sector were more highly educated. They were also younger than the traditional on-farm workforce, and many of them were actually residing in urban areas. A third study that we've looked at succession planning and the role of advisors in terms of creating business continuity through across the process of intergenerational transfer, and the importance of long-term planning, developing managerial characteristics amongst producers, bringing in a diversity of voices, and also developing a long-term support team by collaborating with other professional service providers, which is a theme we've already touched on. So these relationships through the succession planning process were also key to managing long-term planning for both intergenerational transfer, but also for managing risks such as drought. It also encouraged a bit more diversity in terms of who was considered to be a farmer. If an external person could come in and give voice to other members of the family, And succession is particularly important because while we've outlined how complex farming is in general and how it's increasingly complex in this current environment, it's also complex because it's mostly a family run affair. So that adds another layer to the role of professionals in this space. Reiterating the theme that we've heard of already today, that it's a people game. So just to reiterate, I think that in terms of policy going forward, we cannot underestimate the role of professional service providers such as farm advisors in terms of the longevity of the sector and facing the myriad of challenges that we have. And I think that this will also bring more diversity in terms of voices into agriculture that will be crucial going forward as well. So yeah, happy to take some questions towards the end, but otherwise, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lucie. It's a really interesting overview of some of the stats that aren't being captured in terms when we think about agricultural workforce and those sorts of things. And so I think there's a conversation which links nicely to where Richard left off in terms of where policy needs to look in terms of that broader community value. Our third speaker is Professor Ross Kingwell from University of WA. And Ross, you're an agricultural economist of renown, and I'll say of renown. I've read a lot about you in the last few days. You've been working in this space for 2 decades at least. I want to draw you down in your experience to working with farmers and the impact that drought is having on farm businesses and why we're seeing some of the impacts we're having in the farm businesses that you're familiar with.
Sure. So I want to chat to you about some work in which we were able to follow over a decade 240 farm businesses in Western Australia. So we had access to all their financial records each year for 10 years. And we also had access to their meteorological records. As Neal Hughes said earlier, annual rainfall is a fairly poor indicator of the financial impacts of drought. So in the Mediterranean type climate of Western Australian agriculture, so that's cool, wet winters and hot, dry, long summers, most of the rain falls in the growing season, which is May to October. So we used the May to October rainfall as the indicator of drought exposure. So if the farm business had a decile 1 growing season rainfall year, that was deemed to be a drought year for that farm. Over that 10 years, most farms experienced between 1 and 3 droughts, and the most common experience of the 240 farmers was 2 years of drought. And no surprise that whenever a farm experienced drought, that was financially injurious to that business. So there was no upside to drought financially. However, and I'm sure Neal Hughes with the ABARES farm survey data would also verify this, that not all droughts are equal. And that was the experience for these 240 farmers, that some droughts were far worse than others. There were some years, and Neal showed this in his map for 2018-19, when it was a poor year in much of the grain growing regions of Western Australia, and yet some farmers had either average or slightly above average financial years because the low yielding grain was able to be sold in Eastern Australia at highly inflated prices when Eastern Australia was going through the twin years of drought. And similarly, in previous years, there were some farmers who experienced low yields from drought, but they were able to sell their grain on international markets during a period of international price spikes for grain. What we did find is that for the most farms, probably over 90% of the farms at the end of that decade, despite their exposure to drought, were actually wealthier after 10 years. And they were wealthier because of land appreciation, or they had increased their farm size through leasing or purchase, and they had also adjusted their farming systems in a way that delivered greater profits back into the business. One of the curious findings was that the group of farms that experienced consecutive droughts, they, at the end of the decade, ended up being in a more healthy financial position than equivalent farms that experienced 2 separate droughts. And the reason for the superior financial outcome for those farms that experienced consecutive droughts was that the nature of the consecutive droughts forced them out of sheep production. And so they had to make farming system structural changes that increased the dominance of cropping in their farm operations. And that enforced strategic shift in their farm structure across the decade ended up being a superior farming system strategy than the strategy of retaining the same emphasis on sheep production, because consecutive droughts exposed the weakness of running a sheep-dominant farming system. Some other interesting findings were that this group of farms had consultants, and that's the norm in Western Australia. Farm businesses do have consultants, either farm management consultants or agronomists, or even nowadays HR consultants. And we were able to interview all the farm management consultants and get their assessment of the managerial acumen of each of the farm families and get an idea of what had been going on in the farm family business that impacted or was linked to the performance of that farm business. And what we found was that farm performance was beneficially affected by any training that the farm family members had undertaken. So that the more training that the farm family committed to over that decade, the superior was their financial performance. And the magnitude of the farm family's human capital also mattered. So how many sons and daughters you had, how many aunts and uncles, the extended family network that you could draw on was a great benefit to the performance of those farms. Also, the farmers' use of innovations drove their performance, particularly their adoption of key cropping innovations. Also, the farmers' time and organisational management, their engagement in business planning, all those characteristics also positively affected farm performance. In the nitty-gritty, we found that those businesses that were financially growing across the decade, they made better use of leasing, they made more use of contractors, they committed more to superannuation and succession planning, they made greater use of farm management deposits and off-farm assets. They also made greater use of farm business software, they adopted marketing strategies, they used decision support tools, they adopted sooner precision technology, they used electronic paddock recording, and they were early adopters of GPS technologies. And these farms also displayed a greater quality of commitment to the maintenance of their cropping gear. So that they were people who were pretty fastidious about their repairs and maintenance and having their machinery prepared, ready to go. Interestingly, those farms that were more successful were more involved in their local communities. Yes, there were some lone wolves that were very successful, but on the whole, those that were financially more successful across the decade were those that were more highly engaged in their community, and yet they also had a greater care regarding their work-life balance. They were not workaholics. They were people who actually took care of their health and took holidays. So they're probably some of the highlights, Tim, of the research.
Thanks, Ross. And you've painted a really interesting picture of once again that ecosystem of involvement of consultants, you know, and that team that we talked about earlier this morning in terms of being involved. I'd encourage people, if they've got a question, to throw it into the Q&A, and we'll open up for some questions now. I think in summarising, you know, what's come out of those three brief discussion pieces has really been this interconnectedness between, you know, policy right through to at the farm business level in terms of understanding agriculture in a bit of a different sense than we have previously as a mechanism for building resilience. And I think if I could throw that comment in your direction, Ross, is that something that came through from your research, that understanding agriculture more in a business framework rather than in a more traditional framework was part of that mechanism that enabled success? You're just on mute there, Ross.
Yes, that's definitely the case, that those that were more successful tended to be either more financially literate or wise enough to know that they didn't know enough and employed consultants and sought opinion. They were the people that widely thought about their farm business. They spent, as most farmers do, a lot of time stewing over what to do and seeking advice and information. They often did make decisions. That's the other factor, that, you know, there was some comments before about decision paralysis. These were farmers who did make decisions, who did make the difficult calls, or who made the early calls. So they were very much of a mindset that they were running and passing on a business, not just a lifestyle.
Thanks, Ross. There's a question in the Q&A, Ross. That work on the farmers and the business acumen, etc., is that publicly available? Where can people find that information?
Yeah, there's 3 studies, well, 4 studies actually. There's 2 in the Australian Journal of Ag and Resource Economics. There's one in an international journal called Agricultural Systems, and then there's another publicly available report on NCARF out of Griffith University. So there's 4 pieces of work, and I can pass those on to you, Tim. If
that'd be fantastic, Ross, if you could do that. Lucie, a question that exercises my mind in terms of people filling the gaps as government retreats. Has that been filling the gaps because a need was identified, or it related to an opportunity arising around off-farm income and dealing with the pressures of drought?
So not all of the professional service providers also were producers. So I think they're probably separate issues, but there will be some overlap for particular people. So I think Rebecca was probably a good example of that earlier today. Definitely, it's just an entrepreneurial identification of a gap in the market and a need to fill that, and particular motivation to do so, not just because of the financial gains available, but because of the desire to support local communities and the industry more broadly. Some of the people that we interviewed were also retrenched from previous government departments providing those services, and then went into their own private business to provide those services.
So it's interesting how you related that to new entrants into the agricultural space and a new voice in terms of who is farming.
I think that's an interesting cultural outcome.
I think so too. I think that I think the sector will depend upon a diversity in terms of knowledge bases, but also worldviews and positionalities. So it creates, these ability for people who may have been doing this work in an unpaid capacity in family businesses to also enter the market and be to reduce the unpaid work that particularly women do, and also that being able to identify this entrepreneurial opportunity may draw from people outside of agriculture as well. So the quantitative study we saw the transferable skills from people outside of agriculture, that having tech skills or HR skills or marketing skills, then recognising the opportunities that existed in agriculture and moving those transferable skills across to provide services to producers, but also the broader value chain. So I think that cross-fertilisation of knowledge from other sectors is really important to the sector as well.
Yeah, some interesting insights. Richard, a final question, if I might throw to you. We have traditionally done policy in this country a special way. I mean, we've done agricultural policy the same way for the last 40 years or so. What sort of feedback have you had from policymakers as you've raised this idea as we need more effectively evaluated policies that are data driven?
So the problem, Tim, and I think that's one that we'd all recognise, is that there tends to be quite pragmatic, rational, evidence-based discussion about drought policy when we're not in drought. When we are in drought, politics takes over, and there needs to be politicians need to make announceables about what they're doing during a drought. And unfortunately, that tends to lead to bad policy because, the announceables tend to be short-term focused, meeting a need. And what they do is it ends up just adding to that environment of uncertainty and confusion into farm businesses about what the future is going to hold in terms of how the government will respond again, in the next drought. Now, there's a really great comment, I really love it, in the Q&A that's been put up from a farmer about how their best farm consultant empowers them to make decisions and doesn't make them reliable on that consultant. And, I'd reflect that on the policy environment as well. For too long, the policy environment made farmers reliant on government response to get through drought, whether it be a hay subsidy, whatever it is. And I'll finish with just one set of data that I think is really interesting in terms of what that leads to, that government policy reliance. That's probably a bit counterintuitive, but when you look at, say, three groupings, being Australia, New Zealand and the European Union, which have very different levels of government support into agriculture, and you look at the impact of that on farmer retention or the sort of decline in farm numbers, it's quite counterintuitive in that the EU has actually had the largest decline in farm numbers at about 3.7% per annum, followed by Australia, followed by New Zealand. So the country with the least amount of farm support has had the highest farmer retention. The EU has had the greatest amount. So I think that just sort of backs up that, the policy needs to move towards self-reliance, resilience, building skills in farm businesses, and just, that's exactly what that commenter said in the Q&A as well.
So Richard, that's a great place for us to finish up this segment. I really appreciate the input of you all. So thanks, Richard, Lucie and Ross. As Fiona noted earlier, this is really the start of a discussion, and you've got us off to a great start, and really appreciate your time and effort this morning. Thanks very much. Back to you, Fiona.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks to all the presenters. It has been really enlightening, and I've got some notes written down in front of me that says things to do less of, a huge list of things to do more of, and how that links up to what we need to talk to government about. And I've got a really long list of wonderful announceables that government could, announce now in what we would say is the good times. And also, so I guess I'm feeling really buoyed about where the discussion has started, and thank everybody for the context that they've provided. And I think it will stand not only the Victoria Drought Hub in good stead in terms of being able to, put some really good ideas together, but also how we can work across all the other hubs and across all the other service providers to deliver some really tangible outcomes, as I said before. So I would like to introduce Tim Cummins now, just very briefly to wrap up the session. He's been sitting quietly, observing all the conversation. And so, Tim, would you mind wrapping up for us?
No pressure. Thanks, Fiona. It's good. Fantastic presentations and a really good agenda for all the people who did all the hard work thinking this through. I think just looking at the chat, everyone's really enjoying the presentations and learning from them, me included. And I guess in terms of trying to wrap up, although I work for myself as a consultant, I have done for the last 30 years or so, I think about these things through the prism of the role of government. And I think Richard gave us a really good rundown there before about what the role of government should or shouldn't be. And the take-home message from him was that he wanted to incentivise preparation and also training. The questions that Neal had about any injection of training into the human capital in the farming family made a huge difference to the potential to make decisions and get prepared for things. So I think that the take-home message from Richard was, how can we incentivise preparation, and how do we incentivise that training, and how do we incentivise the support network? Seemed to me to be the sort of questions that we heard about. And I guess because we're working for the Drought Hub today, we should think about those 4 stages of drought, which is, I understand, is think about in good times, in uncertainty, in drought, and in recovery. And I think everyone knows that ideally, in the ideal world, we'd have people making these farm plans, or at least drought management plans, or at least thinking through the what-if scenarios that we discussed earlier in good times. I think in practice, there's probably more going to be in the times of uncertainty when people are starting to worry a bit about are we coming out of drought? And in drought, then we do have quite good support networks here in terms of rural financial counsellors and so forth. But obviously, as the first presentation talked us through, that being able to connect people with referrals, put them in touch with the right person, that whole farm advisory ecosystem we heard about in the last few sessions, it's about making sure, how do we make sure we have all those things joined up at each of those 4 stages of drought? How do we build networks in those areas that are poorly serviced? And how do we build capacity to think through those what-if scenarios, at least whether it's an unwritten drought management plan, but ideally a written drought management plan that then people are acknowledge that it will have to be adapted on the fly, because you can't, no plan is going to be completely accurate. And how do we help people move on from unwritten plans to written plans seems to be then a question. And I guess for our purposes today, and for those who've been invited to the next session, we're trying to think through what's actionable or what's researchable that we've learnt from the presentations today that we can pick each other's brains about later on, in order to be able to think through how to incentivise that preparation, incentivise that training. I think that's probably it, Fiona, unless I'll throw back to you, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Look, thank you, everybody. That brings us to the close of the webinar this morning. Really appreciate everybody's time and commitment to being part of the discussion. As I said before, I've got a long list of actionables and potentially announceables for the government. But, it really is the start of the conversation. And look, thank you. And yeah, we hope you've enjoyed the discussion. This presentation, as Kirsten said, has been recorded, so will be available for anybody who wants to revisit it. And we will be taking notes of what's occurred in the chat and using that moving forward.